6:30 in the morning, and the sea off Cape Trafalgar is doing something I've never seen it do before this day. It's carrying 2 entire navies on its back at once. I'm on the gun deck of His Majesty's ship Revenge, 74 guns, standing where I've stood 100 times in drill and never once for real. Word comes down that the enemy's in sight, 33 sail against our 27, and somewhere in the middle of their line, there's a ship so large the lookouts don't believe the first report of her size. 4 decks, 136 guns. The Spanish call her Santísima Trinidad, and even from this distance she looks less like a ship than a fortress that's decided to go for a swim. 27 of us, 33 of them. I do that arithmetic in my head more than once this morning, and it never comes out any better the second time. I didn't get pressed onto this ship, whatever you've heard about how the Navy fills its decks. I walked to the recruiting station myself back in May, 18 years old, my father's leather apron still on my back from the shoemaker's shop I was meant to inherit. The recruiting officer took one look at that apron and thought I was a runaway apprentice. I told him he was wrong. Wasn't running from anything, running towards something more like, though I couldn't have told you what, not then. 6 months on Revenge since. Long enough to learn the ropes, short enough that today still feels like it belongs to someone with more sea years than I've got. What the officers know that morning, and most of us on the lower deck don't, not yet, is that Lord Nelson has thrown out the old way of fighting entirely. The proper way, the way every admiral before him fought a fleet action, is line against line, broadside against broadside, formal as a dance nobody enjoys. Nelson's plan is nothing like that. 2 columns, straight at the enemy's flank, cutting their line rather than matching it. It means we sail toward them for hours, unable to fire back while they can. Every gun on their side bearing on our bows, while ours point uselessly ahead. His own captains call it audacious, some of them privately call it reckless, but every one of them signs on to it without argument, because the alternative, the old way, has never once produced a victory big enough to end this war for good. Nelson wants annihilation, not another indecisive draw. He's willing to pay for it in blood on the approach to get it. Nobody on Revenge knows the name Villeneuve this morning, and if we did, I don't think it would tell us what it tells the history books later. He's the French admiral commanding this whole combined fleet, and he isn't out here today because he wants to be. He'd rather have stayed in Cadiz. Word reaching him days before is that Bonaparte's already decided to replace him. The Emperor's lost patience with a commander who keeps finding reasons not to fight, and a successor is already on the road south to take the fleet out of his hands. Villeneuve sails anyway, not because he believes the plan will work, but because the alternative is watching another man take his command out to sea and win the glory, or the blame, that was supposed to be his either way. He's a man going into the largest battle of his career, mainly to avoid being humiliated out of one first. And there's a particular kind of courage in that, even if it isn't the kind anyone writes songs about afterward. Whatever confidence Nelson's captains carry onto their decks this morning, it isn't matched on the other side of the water. We clear for action before 8. Mess tables struck down, partitions torn out, the whole ship stripped back to a single long space built for nothing but the guns. Sand gets thrown across the decks. Nobody explains why to a man who hasn't seen it before, and nobody needs to. I work it out on my own soon enough. The purser sends round the grog ration early, stronger than usual, and nobody comments on why. Our chaplain moves along the gun deck, saying a few words to whoever wants them and passing quietly by whoever doesn't. A few men write letters they hope somebody delivers if today goes badly. I don't. Never learned enough letters at the shoemaker's to trust myself with what I'd want to say. I check the carronade I'm assigned to instead. Check the flint, check the worm and sponge laid out in their proper order, check it all a third time the same way I'd check a lock I already knew was sound. Officers walk the deck, telling gun captains to hold fire until they're given the word, no matter how close the range gets, no matter what the enemy's doing to us on the way in. Discipline, more than anything else today, is the thing that's going to decide who's still standing by evening. Below, in what's usually the surgeon's own cabin, the tables are already laid out and waiting, and I try not to think too hard about what they're waiting for. A boy not much younger than I was when I first walked into that recruiting station runs messages between decks, quick and small enough to duck under the low beams the rest of us have to stoop for. Somebody starts a song low under his breath, more habit than cheer, and it catches along the gun crew nearest him before dying out again on its own. Nobody tells him to stop. Nobody joins in either. Hours pass like this. 2 fleets closing at not much more than a slow walking pace, close enough by mid-morning to see individual figures moving on the enemy decks, and still too far to do anything about it but watch them get closer. Just before noon, word starts running down every ship in the fleet at once. Lord Nelson's put up a signal. 31 flags strung together, spelling out one line meant for every man aboard every ship, not just the officers who usually read these things. England confides that every man will do his duty, is what he first asked for. His signal lieutenant suggests a small change. Confides has to be spelled out letter by letter. Expects is already sitting in the signal book, ready to hoist in half the time. Nelson agrees without much thought either way. England expects that every man will do his duty. I won't pretend I remember the exact words reaching us on Revenge with the same weight they're given afterward, in the songs and the speeches. What I remember is the cheer. It starts somewhere up the line and rolls down toward us like weather, deck to deck, until men who've never spoken a word to Lord Nelson in their lives are cheering for him like he's standing on our own quarterdeck. We're 8th in our column, and from where Revenge sits in the line, I've got a clear view of what's happening up ahead of us. And it isn't anything like reassuring. Royal Sovereign, Admiral Collingwood's own ship, leads our column, and she's been freshly coppered under the hull, faster in this light wind than anything else in the fleet, ours or theirs. Fast enough that she pulls clean away from the rest of us. By the time she reaches the enemy line, there's nobody else close enough to share what happens next with her. She goes in alone, cuts straight through their formation, and lays herself alongside a Spanish 3-decker near twice her own size. And for what feels like the better part of 10 minutes, though I couldn't swear to the clock, not from this distance, she's taking fire from every ship near enough to reach her while the rest of us are still too far back to help at all. I hear later that Lord Nelson himself watched it and said something about noble Collingwood carrying his ship into action, and that Collingwood, in the thick of it, wondered aloud what Nelson would give to be there instead of watching. I believe both stories. Neither man strikes me as someone who'd waste a good line, even under fire. Watching her take that alone, from 8 ships back with nothing to do about it but keep closing the distance, does something to the pace of my own heartbeat that no amount of drill ever quite prepared me for. This is the part nobody warns you about beforehand, and I don't think words do it justice even now. We sail straight at their line for the better part of an hour, dead slow, and their guns start finding our range long before ours can answer at all. Round shot comes through the bow first, the whole length of the ship, taking down anyone standing in a straight line behind it. A man 3 feet from me goes down without a sound, loud enough to hear over everything else. And there's nothing to do but keep my place at the gun and wait for the order that still hasn't come. I watch the man next to me count under his breath. Not prayers, just numbers, one after another, like counting was the only thing left his mind could hold on to that wasn't fear outright. Waiting under fire you can't return is its own particular kind of fear, and I hope I never learn it better than I already have by the time we finally close the distance. When we finally come alongside an enemy ship, close enough that our carronades can do what they're built for, something changes in every man on this deck at once. The waiting's over. My gun crew fires, hauls back, sponges, loads, fires again, and I stop being able to count how many times we've done it somewhere around the 4th or 5th. Smoke fills the deck thick enough that I'm firing at a shape more than a ship, aiming by the last position I saw rather than anything I can actually see now. The noise doesn't stop being loud. It stops being noise at all, somewhere past the first quarter hour, and becomes something closer to weather, a condition you're standing inside rather than a sound you're hearing. We don't know it yet, not on Revenge, not for hours, but somewhere in that same smoke, aboard the Victory, Lord Nelson is walking his own quarterdeck with Captain Hardy when a musket ball fired from the fighting top of the French Redoutable finds him. It goes through his shoulder, through a lung, lodges near his spine. He knows before anyone tells him. "They've done for me at last, Hardy," he's reported to have said. What he said as he was dying below decks afterward is less certain than the history books usually let on. "Kiss me, Hardy," is the version everyone remembers, though even the men who were in that cabin didn't all agree afterward on the exact words, and at least one account written days later tells it differently again. What isn't disputed is that he lived another 3 hours, long enough to be told the battle was won, before he died with the fighting still going on somewhere above his head. Elsewhere in that same smoke, Men We'll Never Meet are proving today isn't only a story about British nerve. Aboard the San Juan Nepomuceno, a Spanish officer named Cosme Chiruca has both legs taken by a single cannon shot while he's still calling out orders to his gun crews, and refuses, with what strength he's got left, to let his flag come down. Aboard the Príncipe de Asturias, Admiral Gravina takes a wound that will end his life within months, slowly, after the smoke's long cleared. Whatever this day gets remembered for on the British side, it isn't decided by cowardice on the other one. Something happens on our own deck partway through the afternoon that none of the drill books ever prepared a man for. A boat comes alongside from the Pickle, and what they fished out of the water isn't a sailor at all. A young Frenchwoman, stripped near to nothing by the fire that drove her off the burning Achille, brought aboard shaking and past speech. Among the prisoners already crowding our lower deck, she finds her own husband, alive, and for one strange stretch of minutes in the middle of a battle, there's a small knot of officers arguing cheerfully over who's got a spare shirt fit to lend a lady. It's the closest thing to gentleness I see all day, and it happens in the middle of the loudest, ugliest hour of my life. Back to the guns after that, and the fighting's closer now, hulls near enough to touch in places along the line. Smoke sits so thick between decks that a man's more likely to know his own gun crew by voice than by sight. Sand on the decks gone dark in patches I choose not to look at too closely. A splinter the length of my forearm takes a man down 2 guns along from mine. Not the ball itself, just what the ball tears loose from the ship's own timber on its way through. And I'm told after that splinters account for more wounds this day than shot ever does. Somebody's shouting for the carpenter's mate, and somebody else is shouting back that he's already busy 3 decks over. Somewhere down the line, a ship's colors come down, and a ragged half-cheer goes up from whoever's close enough to see it happen. Gone again in a moment because there's still a war to finish on the rest of the line. By late afternoon, it isn't really a battle in the sense it was at noon. It's dozens of smaller fights, ship against ship, and one by one the enemy colors start coming down along the length of it. I watch a Spanish first-rate striker flag not far off our beam, and for the first time since the sand went down on this deck this morning, I let myself believe we might actually be winning this. The news reaches Revenge sometime after the guns finally fall silent, passed ship to ship the same way the signal was hours before. Except this time, nobody's cheering. Lord Nelson is dead. Won the battle and didn't live to hear the last of it confirmed. Grown men on this deck, men who spent the whole day doing their jobs without a tremor in their hands, go quiet in a way that feels heavier than anything the fighting itself managed to do to them. We've won. It doesn't feel the way I always imagined winning would feel. What follows that night is, by every account I've heard since, worse in its own way than the battle itself. The wind rises past anything a damaged fleet is built to survive. Revenge herself fought 3 separate enemy ships across that afternoon. A Spanish 74 that finally hauled off, badly broken, then a French one we left dismasted for others to finish, then a third we rammed and crippled before the smoke got too thick to see who took her after that. By nightfall, we're not thinking about any of them. We're battered, rigging shot through in a dozen places, and the whole crew spends that night just keeping our own ship afloat rather than chasing anything the guns won. 2 days into the storm, word runs through the fleet that a French commander named Cosmeo has put back out from Cadiz with what's left seaworthy of the combined fleet, trying to snatch some of the captured prizes back before the weather finishes them for good. It costs him ships of his own doing it. The sea takes as much from that attempt as it gives back, but it's enough to worry Collingwood into scuttling some of the most damaged prizes rather than risk losing them to a second boarding. Ship after captured vessel goes down that week, some driven onto the rocks near Cadiz, some retaken by their own crews, overpowering the handful of British sailors left aboard to hold them, others burned or sunk outright rather than handed back. Men on Revenge who'd fought all day at their guns spend that same night bailing and rigging jury masts instead, too busy keeping their own ship afloat to spare much thought for the prizes going down around us in the dark. Of everything this fleet took today, only a small handful of prizes will ever actually reach Gibraltar. The sea, in the end, undoes more of this victory than the enemy managed to. Villeneuve survives the battle, taken prisoner aboard his own flagship, treated with the same courtesy any defeated admiral would expect from Nelson's fleet, and eventually released to make his way home to France months later. What waits for him there isn't the mercy the British showed him. Napoleon has no patience left for a commander who lost the fleet he was ordered to save, and word of the disgrace coming his way travels ahead of him faster than he can outrun it. In April of 1806, in a hotel room in the town of Rennes, Villeneuve is found dead. 6 wounds to the chest, a note beside him. The official finding is suicide, a man choosing his own end rather than the one being prepared for him in Paris. Some who knew him never quite believed a man could manage 6 wounds to himself with a single blade, and the rumor that he was silenced rather than broken by his own hand has never fully gone away. Either way, the man who sailed out of Cadiz mainly to avoid one kind of humiliation ends up not escaping it after all. We limp into Gibraltar days later, what's left of us, towing what's left of what we won. 27 ships went into that morning. None were lost outright, though you wouldn't call more than a few of us whole. The other side lost most of a navy, and lost it in an afternoon that started with 2 long lines of sail closing slow across calm water and ended with a storm finishing off what the guns hadn't already claimed. I think about the shoemaker's apron sometimes, the one I walked away from in May. I think about a Frenchwoman finding her husband in the middle of the loudest hour of my life, and a Spanish officer refusing to strike his flag with both legs gone, and an admiral who won everything and didn't live to be told so properly, and another admiral on the losing side who went to his own death anyway, months later and an ocean away from any of our guns. None of it adds up to a simple kind of victory, the kind you'd want to tell as a story with just one shape to it. It was a victory all the same. I was there, and I'm still here to say so. And some mornings, sitting somewhere a long way from that gun deck now, that's the only arithmetic that matters.